Nib is the problem, not Baron or Apo. Nib is the problem, not Baron or Apo. What do you mean by that? Do you think Nibiru is the reason why Yu-Gi-Oh is the way it is nowadays? Like I like, well, problem is a harsh word, first of all. Like, the thing is, if anything, that, like, I don't know, what would, if I had to put it into like one word, if I have to, like, not one word, but if I had to like describe what the problem with modern Yu-Gi-Oh is, if there even is a problem, like, I'm gonna be honest with you, every time I complain or every time I give criticism to the game, I still, like, I want to emphasize, like, I still love this game, and I still think it's a really good game no matter what. It's got worse formats sometimes, you know. Sometimes a format is very good, sometimes a format is not so good. That's very natural, I think, in any card game you play. But if I had to, like, describe what's the most concerning, let's say most concerning, because it's not like straight up bad, but like the most concerning thing about modern Yu-Gi-Oh is how, like, I think too much happens in one turn, which is not necessarily bad. I think long turns are not necessarily a problem. The only thing that is a problem is when the player going first does so many things on their first turn, because the first turn is, per definition, the least interactive turn in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Because Yu-Gi-Oh is in theory a super interactive game, right? Because of, like, how there's, like, games that are more designed to be more played alongside each other, right? Like, for example, the Pokemon trading card game, where, like, you both kind of do your thing. And even Magic, to an extent, is like this, because I think it's a little harder to interact with. For example, you can't just go and attack your opponent's creatures in Magic, right? You have to, like, attack the opponent directly, and they decide whether they block or not. So if you have, like, a really annoying creature on the field in Magic, you have to, like, spend a spell card to deal with it. You can't just attack it, right? In Yu-Gi-Oh, you can basically interact with your opponent's stuff super heavily, right? The problem is, in the first turn of the game, and it's specifically the first turn of the game, you can't interact with your opponent because you haven't had the chance to put stuff onto the board yet, right? You hadn't had the chance to set trap cards yet, quick play spells, you can't activate spells, you couldn't have put any monsters onto the field yet and interact with your opponent. So, like, the more weight, I think, is on the first turn in Yu-Gi-Oh, the less interactive it becomes. Maybe. Appreciate you for the 4 months. Thank you. The thing is, and I think that's the thing, right? Because I think the majority of people would agree that the more interactive a card game is, the more fun it is. Generally, like, a lot of people, I think, would agree to that, especially when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Like, whenever you have a very interactive game, those tend to be more fun, right? Which in return makes it so that doing as much as possible on your first turn is not great, you know. And so I think blaming hand traps is kind of like a weak argument, because hand traps are, I'll admit it, hand traps are like a band-aid fix to these kind of problems, but hand traps are at least an attempt at making or at creating more interaction on the very first turn of the game, because that is the most crucial turn where it's like disproportionate, right? Like it's the least interactive turn by default, but it's also getting more and more important on what happens there, right? More stuff happens in a turn that is the least interactive, which is kind of like that is a direction that you don't want to go in, right? You don't want to put more weight on the first turn and have less interaction on it, right? And so there's two ways you can, quote unquote, tackle this problem if you want to in future card design, right? For Konami, I guess. The one way would be you remove some weight from the first turn, right? You'd have to create more archetypes and meta relevant cards that are like more focused on playing more turns rather than just making one big board on the first turn, or you need to create more interaction for the first turn. But that just results in like typically more hand traps and stuff like that, which I don't know if that's something that they want to do, right? There's two modes that I'm in when I play this game. The one mode is I try hard, right? I try hard, and I just when I'm in that mode, I basically don't complain about the game at all. I just take it as it is. I just play it, and I try to do well in how the game is, right? I don't care about what the game could be. I just look at it. Okay, this is how the game is being played at the moment, and I try to do well, right? And in that one, I usually just, you know, accept things as they are and play accordingly, right? The second mode is when I just play to have fun, right? When I just play stuff that I like, because not always they don't always go hand in hand. Of course, I have fun tryharding as well. There's fun aspects there too, but there are some aspects that I'm missing. Like, for example, sometimes the best decks in the game are not the decks that I enjoy the most, right? Like, for example, super interactive decks like the paleo deck that I played 2 weeks ago, that is nowhere close what I would play if I was tryharding that event, right? So whenever I'm not tryharding and just playing the stuff that I really like, then I'm starting to notice that there are things about modern Yu-Gi-Oh that I wish were a little bit different, right? Like, I don't mind the way the game is. I think it's fine, and I still enjoy it very much. But if I could choose, if I had the choice, would I change it just a little bit? Yeah, maybe I would make it a little bit slower and a little bit less focused on the first turn. I don't want it to go back to how it was. I think that's a relatively weak argument, like, because if I just want to play the game like it was in 2017, I could just go and play like Time Wizard format. That's completely fine, and I think development is very important. So your suggestion is basically, instead of having 15 card extra deck and 15 card side deck set, you basically have a pool of 30 that you can adjust up and down. I mean, I think from the personal perspective, this would just straight up be better, right? Because then it'd be completely broken. It'd be completely broken because some decks don't need the extra deck, so they can just side 30 cards. Like, you look at, like, I don't know, Fluanderees or Monarchs or whatever, like decks that don't really need the extra deck, or Labyrinth, right? They can just go and play a 30 card side deck, or like a 20 card side deck, or 25 card side deck, right? And they can just make their deck super broken after siding for every matchup, which would feel kind of toxic. You know, it would feel kind of bad in practice. Like, it sounds good maybe, but in practice you would be like, oh well, I'm playing against this Labyrinth deck, right? Maybe I have a relatively easy time game one, but then after siding they can just side in all the hate for my deck, right? And they can just basically floodgate or play the most broken cards for every matchup after siding, right? Which I think is weird. And then also at the same time, like, if you play against some decks that really can do some crazy stuff if they have more extra, I think you're just encouraging more broken decks with that, which I don't think that's the solution, right? We have talked about this at some point in the past, where I think there is design space there to be explored when you look at it. Like, they have, for example, they have made decks or cards that have incentivized you to play no extra deck, for example, or less extra deck, right? Like, we look at like no extra deck Monarchs, for example, right? I think there's other things that they could explore that mess with the rules of deck building, right? Like, I've seen this in other games and I've always liked it a lot, where maybe they have never done something like this, right? Where maybe you can, and there's so many things that you can imagine, even off the top of my head, that you could do to spice things up, right? Maybe you can print a card that says you can have 4 copies of this in your deck, and then maybe that's interesting. Or maybe you print a card that says if you put this into your deck can have more than 60 cards. Or if you put this card into your extra deck, then you can have more than 15 cards in your extra deck. We thought of this specifically for Salamangreat, because Salamangreat seems like it's at a handicap for no reason, because their gimmick is like having multiple copies of everything in the extra deck, right? So one thing that was on my mind when I thought about that was like, hey, what if you made it so that the duplicates of Salamangreats, they don't count towards your extra deck limit? Right, so like the first Sunlight Wolf counts, but then the second and the third one don't, right? And then that way you can play Salamangreat with more extra deck slots, right? But it wouldn't be like you couldn't do it in just like every deck. Like for example, just slap 3 Sunlight Wolves into every deck because you can just use Prosperity and Extravagance with it. I don't know. Because you still have to like sacrifice actual slots, because the first Sunlight Wolf takes up a slot, right? I think that'd be interesting, like a way, like messing around with that stuff, because if you think about it, actually, I think it's weird that the game's been around for what, like 25th anniversary, and we haven't messed with any of that design space at all, right? Which I'm always for. I'm always for messing around with those sort of design spaces a little bit, right? Because we've had new cards with new effects, but we've never had anything that actually messed with how you build the decks in that sense, right? You've never had something that maybe allows you to play more side deck or more extra deck or whatever like that. I think that'd be interesting, but yeah, I'm yapping. Hearthstone had the issue of doing that, and it's even worse for new players. I mean, is it? Is it that bad for new players? I feel like it's not that big of a deal, right? I don't think it's that big of a deal. Like, yeah, an experienced player, like let's use the example that I just made. Like, let's say Salamangreat is the only deck in the game that has the ability to play more than 15 extra deck cards, right? Because they print a statement on the Salamangreat Link monsters that says, if this is in your extra deck, you can play, or like, let's make it less broken to begin with. Let's say the third copy of this card does not count towards your extra deck limit. So you can play 3 Sunlight Wolves, but it only counts as 2, right? That way, if you want to play 3 Balings and 3 Sunlight Wolves, it doesn't take up 6 slots, it takes up 4, and so on and so forth, right? Let's make it less broken, just to make it more imaginable, right? So Salamangreat is the only deck that can exceed 15 extra deck cards because of that rule. First thing is, would that even be a problem? Because arguably Salamangreat should have, if anything, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Salamangreat should have an upside when you play it rather than a downside. Because the fact that you have to fill your entire extra deck with Salamangreat cards is an actual downside if you want to play Salamangreat. Like, that extra deck is so tight for no reason. Like, it's not like your extra deck is super tight because you need so many different utility options. No, your extra deck is so tight because you have to play the same thing multiple times to even get its full effect, right? Like, you don't get actual utility in a Salamangreat extra deck. You just get like the same thing over and over. Like, it's actually not, it's just tight for no reason, right? So you could help decks this way, right? If you want to make a cool gimmick like relinking, sure, do it, but don't handicap the deck because of it, right? But at the same time, this is not even strictly an advantage, right? Because if you're going second and your opponent looks at your extra deck and they see, oh, you're playing 20 extra deck cards, you now know what you're playing against. You can make your turn with the full knowledge of what your opponent is playing, right? So like, you can like blind dweller them and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think that'd be okay. I think it'd be an interesting thought experiment, at least, which makes me wonder why they haven't messed around with any of that in the past. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about this exact example in the past before, so